everyone. Very nice to see you all. There are a few more than 1 million lawyers in America. And virtually every one of them, buried on their hard drive, has a document by the same name. You know what that name is? Chapter 1. Chapter 1. And it all started in 1987 with the publication of Presumed Innocent, which not only launched the fiction writing career of Scott Turow, but created an industry of the legal thriller. Now, you are not responsible for all the crap that came afterward, but you did create the industry, and it has unfortunately persuaded a lot of lawyers that they are both more interesting and better writers than they really are. But it has launched Scott's tremendous career, and since 1987, if you look on the inside flap of Ultimate Punishment, you will see with metronomic precision every 3 years there has been yet another terrific and best-selling book, culminating, or not, I would say culminating, or most recently in the fiction department with Reversible Errors, a book that deals in part with our subject tonight. Scott is, as I'm sure you all know, a Chicagoan, a subject we'll get to, and a graduate of Stanford undergrad and Harvard Law School, which produced his first best-selling book and first nonfiction book, 1L, which is still indispensable for all students heading off to law school. And he is also a real lawyer. Remains a real lawyer. He was an assistant U.S. attorney in Chicago and remains a partner at Sonnenschein, Nath, and Rosenthal in Chicago. And I urge you all to join me in welcoming the great Scott Turow. But let's talk about Chicago first. Scott is many things. He is also a devout, recently told me that in an average season, he either listens to or watches 130 Cubs games. Not all in part, but... So my first question, Scott, is how you doing a day later?
You know, the truth is, yesterday I really did feel like a truck ran over my heart. But today I've managed to put it behind me and sort of going back to my normal state of Cub fandom, which is, you know, to accept the bitter with the bad. And
do you have any thoughts on whether it's worse to be a Red Sox fan or better, or how, can you compare the nature of the suffering?
Well, I think that the Red Sox fans who complain about the fact that their team hasn't won the World Championship since 1917, whereas of course we haven't won since 1908, but they ignore the fact that they've played in the World Series 4 or 5 times in the 58 years that we haven't. We haven't been there since 1945. And of course, here in San Diego, we are at the site of, one of the, we now have a sort of, we have a holy trinity of disasters now. We have 69, we have 84 right here, and now, of course, we have 2003.
Well, you sure do. So we're going to cheer you up by talking about executions now. So our subject today is Scott's new book, nonfiction, Ultimate Punishment. And you're a big shot novelist. Why'd you write a book about death penalty? What prompted you to do that?
The novel, Reversible Errors, which is about a man on death row whose case is revived as he's about to be executed. I was really committed to not standing on a soapbox in writing the book. And I just found that I had a lot of sort of information, reflections that I'd gathered, and I thought that I had a response on the death penalty that was probably more typical than the literature of capital punishment, which is, made up principally of people who are, very strongly for it or very strongly against it.
Well, and talk about that. You did not come into this unlike a lot of people, with strongly held views on the death penalty, one way or the other, right?
Yeah, well, I always say that I don't criticize anybody's views about the death penalty because I have held them all. You know, I've gone through my own journey with this, back and forth. And rather than assuming that I was a fool when I was younger, I realized that this is a difficult issue, and one which I think the visceral arguments are apparent to people on both sides.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that the claim that some murders are so horrible that we have to make some ultimate statement about them, and on the other hand, the extraordinary cruelty of putting another human being to death in the cool, calculated way that we do when we execute. Both of those arguments, I think, find their way into the hearts of most Americans. They can understand both arguments. And I think people are far more ambivalent about this, the death penalty, than the mere poll numbers which say, do you believe in the death penalty? And you know, we get somewhere between 60 and 70% of Americans who say they do. But I think that beneath that there's more turmoil and uncertainty.
So you started, to the extent you started thinking about the death penalty, I mean, as a kid, when you were at Stanford or in graduate school in Stanford, you were pretty much categorically opposed, right?
Categorically opposed. Because, you know, the 60s, everybody was wonderful. You know, all souls, everybody was a good person. You know, those who didn't do good things hadn't had the chance to do good things. And, you know, it was this Aquarian faith. And therefore, if you take that point of view, it's clear that execution is a horror.
So what started moving you away from that? What got you to your agnostic position?
Becoming a prosecutor, an assistant United States attorney in Chicago. I was an AUSA in the era when there was no federal death penalty.
So you didn't try death penalty cases yourself?
I did not. I never tried a death penalty case myself. I had one murder case that landed on my doorstep. It stayed there for about 2 hours. But I was astonished during that period of time. It was an Assimilated Crimes Act case.
Talk about that case. What was that case?
Well, this was a case where a patient in the North Chicago Veterans Administration Hospital had changed the channel on the television set, and another patient had responded to that by stomping him to death. And generally speaking, the crimes that are committed on so-called federal reservations are regarded as rather piddling matters, and so they're assigned to brand new assistant United States attorneys. And this case came in on the watch of my closest friend in the office, so he asked me would I work on it with him. And as we began to figure out what the Assimilated Crimes Act said, it says that a state law crime committed on a federal reservation is tried in federal court but punished according to state law. In short, here we were, two assistant U.S. attorneys who'd come to the job assuming there was no federal death penalty, finding that we were going to have to confront, in this case, whether or not the death penalty would be applied to this man. Now, of course, our supervisors quickly heard that, you know, two young assistants who had between the two of them about 3 months' experience practicing law had a murder case on their docket, and quickly I was displaced, and happy to be displaced because I really was shocked as I thought about that question. Could I actually stand before a jury and ask for someone's life?
But even though you wound up not trying that case, the experience of prolonged professional exposure to criminals had an impact on you.
Yes, it has. I mean, Jeff and I share this experience of having been prosecutors, and you know, you just it's an extraordinary postgraduate education, and not to be too coarse, but it really gives you a proctologist's view of humankind.
And you know, you didn't execute anybody, but I mean, personally, but you didn't. But you started thinking that maybe it wasn't so bad to execute people.
I began to understand the point of view that said, in the worst, the rare cases, this is an ugly necessity. I was willing to accept the death penalty when one of my best friends in the office was deputized as a state prosecutor and tried and won a capital conviction. I felt that I too could have done what my friend Jeremy had done and stand before a jury and say, this man, should not live further. Not that I was completely persuaded that I agreed with that solution, but that I recognized that the validity of the moral views that led the community to feel that way.
And was that basically your attitude as you moved from being a prosecutor to being a defense lawyer?
Yeah.
Tell us about Messrs. Hernandez and Cruz. Tell the story who they are. This in your defense world.
When I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I left with the full intention of becoming a criminal defense lawyer, but I thought I was going to defend white-collar cases. After presumed innocent and the burden of proof, I began to be interested, in addition to doing that, in representing poor people. And that led me into the state courts and slowly to some exposure to murder cases. And eventually I was asked to take on the appeal of Alex Hernandez. And when the case came to me, Alex had been convicted for the second time of the murder of a 10-year-old girl who'd been abducted, raped, and beaten to death.
Well, pause for a moment. This was a celebrated crime in
Yes.
Chicago. Talk a little bit about, and for good reason. I mean, celebrated in the sense of because of its true monstrosity.
Well, it was celebrated for complex reasons. But in February of 1983, a little girl named Janine Nicarico was abducted from within her home. The front door was kicked in, and she was found 3 days later, clad only in a nightgown and with a blindfold on. She had been subjected to a variety of sexual assaults, and as I say, beaten, the back of her head had been beaten in. It was a horrible crime, but part of the horror was because the people in the suburbs didn't think crimes of that nature would come and visit them. And the parents were, of course, immensely distraught and very photogenic, and their particular way of expressing their grief involved them in making themselves available. And the profile of the case rose and rose and rose, and two young Hispanic men, Cruz and Hernandez, were arrested for the crime based mostly on a series of mutual accusations they'd made against each other in response to the offer of a $10,000 reward. Both were tried, both were sentenced to death early in 1984, and then about 6 months later, another little girl was abducted about an hour's drive away, assaulted.
While Cruz and Hernandez were in prison.
They are now literally, at this point, on death row. Similar murder. This time the police apprehend a man named Brian Dugan, and in the course of plea bargaining, Dugan admits not only did he kill the second little girl, but he and he alone murdered Janine Nicarico.
So what happens then?
What happens then is that the prosecutors who sent Hernandez and Cruz to death row spent the next 10 years trying to prove that Dugan was lying, and prosecuting and maintaining the prosecutions of Cruz and Hernandez, both of whom were given retrials for unrelated reasons and both convicted again. And only in 1995, when DNA provided yet the most publicly acceptable form of corroboration for Dugan's confession, and at the same time a police officer admitted that he had given false testimony in earlier proceedings in Rolando's then third trial. Both men were finally released late in 1995.
And what was your role in the case?
I represented Alex in his second appeal. This was This case is so procedurally complex that it'd be impossible to describe it even in a long period of time. But I basically represented Alex from 1991 to 1995 and was also involved because of that in Rolando's defense in some measure.
You were a prosecutor. You like prosecutors. In your fiction, you write about prosecutors in, you know, like all Turow characters, they are morally complicated, but they are, you were sympathetic to the prosecution function. What was your reaction to the prosecutors in the Cruz and Hernandez case?
I was sympathetic to. This was the most egregious misbehavior by prosecutors I had ever seen. Reading the transcripts of Alex's 3 trials, when I got into the case, I found myself literally shaking with rage at moments, because I didn't believe any American could be treated the way he and Rolando were treated at times in our judicial system by these prosecutors. The most extraordinary story concerns Alex's second trial, when he was on trial for his life, when the prosecutor attempted to put in evidence some shoe prints that were found outside the Nicarico house. Now, there's a tread pattern in those shoe prints, and he put a witness on to testify that the shoe prints were size 6. It so happened that they were a woman's size 6, and the tread pattern corresponded to a woman's shoe, a fact that he did not disclose to the defense. And that's the way these cases were prosecuted for 10 years, as these men attempted to defend, what they had done.
This is the Cruz and Hernandez cases do not take place in isolation in Illinois. The mid-90s are they're a remarkable series of disclosures about unjust convictions, most notably by the Chicago Tribune, in a remarkable series that they did. Are you starting to reevaluate your thoughts in light of all this? Or what are your thoughts about the death penalty in terms of what's going on in Illinois, your home state?
Well, originally, if you asked me in 1991 and 92, I would have said Cruz and Hernandez has nothing to do with the death penalty. It's about bad prosecutors. It's about bad faith in our system. But of course, as people continue to march off death row in Illinois and other states, most of them exonerated by DNA, but also many by discoveries concerning invalid eyewitness testimony and false confessions. I began to realize that, of course, Alex and Rolando's case was symptomatic of something that infects particularly capital litigation, which is innocent defendants being convicted and sentenced to death.
The governor of Illinois during this period in the 90s is a fellow named George Ryan. Talk about George Ryan.
George Ryan became governor in 1998. He was a plain-spoken, unworldly guy, former pharmacist from Kankakee, Illinois. Rotund, jowly, and he had sponsored Illinois' new death penalty law when the death penalty was revived in Illinois, as it was in almost in 38 other states in 1977. And he had an extraordinary awakening on this issue. And of course, to give it a Shakespearean overtone, all of this is taking place at the same time that Ryan himself becomes more and more at the center of an investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office of corruption in the Office of Secretary of State, where Ryan previously served. And yet, as the number of exonerations in Illinois mounted, there were finally 13 by the beginning of 2000, George Ryan decided, by the way, after signing a death warrant,
he did sign one?
He signed one death...
And was someone executed?
Someone, yes.
He did preside over one execution.
Anthony Corcarellis was executed, and the governor found it a completely unpalatable experience because he every time he asked a question, and the people around him were telling him, it's okay to go ahead with this execution. This guy is really guilty. He'd say, well, what about the police officers who investigated the case? Well, they're the same police officers who investigated Hernandez and Cruz, but they got this one right. And, well, how do we know we got it right? Well, because this guy confessed. Well, tell me about the confession. Well, he was chained to a bed for 17 hours. Well, and, well, okay, but his co-defendants testified against him. And what happened to them? Well, they got lesser sentences. So he says, so only this guy is getting the death sentence.
Is that the one guy who was executed?
Yeah, that's Corcarellis.
Corcarellis was investigated by the Cruz and Hernandez cops?
Yes,
Wow.
Same cops. Same cops. And the governor knew a lot about Cruz and Hernandez by then. So he signed the death warrant, and afterwards he was so shaken by the experience. He said, I'm not doing this again. I just don't ever want to do this again until I know that this system is far more accurate than I find it to be right now.
So he created this commission on the death penalty with you on it.
Right.
What did the commission do? What was the assignment of the commission?
Well, there were 14 of us. We were drawn from across the state. 12 of us were lawyers. And our assignment was really fairly simple. What reforms, if any, would make the death penalty in Illinois fair, just, and accurate? And he had no brief for us. It was clear from the beginning that we could come back with one recommendation or a whole long list of them. We ultimately made 85, some of them of minor scope, some of them of very large scope.
But what did you do on the commission? What did you do?
What I did, we had subcommittees, and I made it my business, though, to begin to try to really come to terms with this issue that had so long divided me against myself. And basically...
And I should add, I mean, the coming to terms is really what's reflected in Ultimate Punishment.
Right.
That is what the book is.
Right. I mean, the book is a memoir, really, of these cases, the time on the commission, and the sort of intellectual and emotional processes I was going through at the time. But I just asked myself, okay, now what is the death penalty for? What does it accomplish? What are its benefits? What are its detriments? I tried to be as systematic as I could at looking at certain issues.
And what struck you most as you started to look at the death penalty in action in Illinois?
Well, for me, the most striking thing is the utter capriciousness of who gets sentenced to death. You have death row on which people like John Wayne Gacy were at that time. Well, he was executed in '94, but monstrous crimes. Gacy killed 33 young men, and in a bestial manner too. But you have Gacy and other very grave criminals and murderers there. But you also have people like my former client, Christopher Thomas.
That's another case that obviously had a big impact on you.
Right.
Tell the Thomas story.
Chris Thomas was a 21-year-old, raised literally in a crack house in Chicago. Never got anything from anybody. Eventually moved up to Waukegan because he had an aunt up there who kind of cared about him. And he and two buddies were out one night. They were stoned. They were driving around. They ran out of gas. They got the brilliant idea that they were going to roll somebody for gas money. And a fine young man, Rafael Gasconia, a Filipino immigrant, came out to take a smoke behind the place where he worked. And he was set upon by Chris and his two friends. And Gasconia worked hard for the money in his pocket. He was not about to give it up. He struggled. Chris had a gun, and he killed him. And for this very grave crime, Chris deserved to be severely punished.
And this is not Cruz and Hernandez. Chris was not innocent.
Chris is not. Well,
Oh, see, the lawyer is now. He's like, well, he was sort of innocent.
No, it was never an issue in my mind.
Right, okay.
You know, we have this kind of reversal of fortune thing going on in the law firm where I've got all these young lawyers working with me, and they want, you know, they want another Hernandez. We got another innocent client, and I'm like, no, I don't think so. This guy's 2 defendants rolled over on him. He made statements to a bunch of other people. He confessed 3 times, including once on videotape. I don't think so. But, you know, it was significant that he did indeed confess. He expressed his remorse, and the state responded to his contrition by putting him on trial for his life. Now, clearly what they thought they were going to accomplish was to get him to plead guilty quickly, then get rid of the case. But they elected to pursue the death penalty in this case. Appointed for Chris were 2 lawyers, neither one of whom had tried a death penalty case either as a prosecutor or as a defense lawyer. One had been standby counsel for a pro se defendant, a serial murderer who was on his 5th or 6th death sentence at the time of this case. One of them happened to have prosecuted Chris's aunt on a drug charge that the whole family regarded as bogus.
One of Chris's lawyers had prosecuted Chris's aunt.
Right. So she hated the lawyers. Under her influence, Chris soon hated the lawyers. When they told him to plead guilty, he said, nothing doing. And besides, what it had gotten him up till now, to be honest. So he decided to say he had nothing to do with these murders. When he told that to the sentencing judge, who'd never sentenced anybody to death, Chris became the first.
This relates to your point about capriciousness, and one of, I think, lay people, ordinary people, like to think that, what couldn't we design a death penalty that only gets the John Wayne Gacy's, the Timothy McVeigh's, the really bad people that I think most people think would not grieve too much about the state executing. Why can't you design something that just gets to them?
Well, this is one of the more interesting things about the existence of the death penalty, which is that once you've got it, it expands. And that's because everybody's idea of what's a crime of utmost moral gravity is a little bit different. Some people are concerned about the murders of children. Some people get very excited about murders that have a sexual component. Obviously, some people, and appropriately, care about, you know, mass murderers, serial murderers, contract murderers, the cool contemplated murder of somebody by a contract, you know, pre-existing understanding that you'll go kill somebody. Police, of course, want the special protection of the death penalty. When the police get it, the firefighters want it.
Murder of a policeman, murder of a firefighter,
right. Then, you know, you've got correctional institutions. Obviously, you want to have some incremental punishment available in correctional institutions in case people murder again. And so it goes.
And Illinois law reflected these concerns, that you had each, and
we started with 7 eligibility categories in Illinois in 1977. We now have 21, and despite the tremendous momentum for reform and the courage of many of our legislators, none of them will even talk about repealing any of those eligibility categories.
Because they don't want to answer to the firefighters or to any of these.
And God forbid somebody will then commit a murder that fits. I mean, many of these categories have never even been used. But God forbid somebody commits a murder that would fit in that category and it had been repealed.
So once you have it in all these categories, talk about the influence in plea bargaining. I mean, Chris's case seems like a classic example, is that once it's in the system, it's going to be used by the system.
Right. I mean, certainly the greatest, and to me the most peculiar qualification factor for the death penalty is felony murder. If you commit a murder in the course of committing another felony, and you shoot intentionally, it's not accidental. In most states in this country that have a death penalty, you are subject to the death penalty. I'm pretty sure California is among those states. Well, you've taken in, with that category, an enormous number of, it's a terrible phrase, but it's appropriate, garden variety murders.
Because it's murder during a bank robbery,
Right.
Murder during a kidnapping, murder during
a liquor store
robbery, and all those are under felony murder.
Right, and and so once the category's there, prosecutors routinely charge it, knowing that it'll force the defendant to plead guilty, and plead guilty they do.
Except Chris.
Well, Chris wouldn't do it, and you want to believe that innocent people wouldn't plead guilty, but I am pretty certain we will see in the next several years a DNA exoneration of somebody who pled guilty to a murder. Because think of the situation. The state has a strong case. Your lawyer tells you, so here's your choice: live or die. And I know the choice that I would probably make.
Subject that is always connected to the death penalty is race. Yes. And on the commission, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about race and the death penalty in a complicated way. Not, I mean, the cliched reaction to the death penalty, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, is that black people are executed more than white people. It comes down harder on blacks than white. What's the real story as you learned?
Well, it remains an incredibly complicated story. 55% of the homicides in the United States are committed by African Americans.
I've heard you use that statistic before. It's an amazing statistic. When you consider that African Americans are 10-12% of the population, they commit 55% of the murders.
That's from David Baldus at the University of Iowa. So the fact that we have so many dark faces on our death rows does not represent necessarily some differential impact by the justice system. But it gets complicated after that. In Illinois, for example, we found today, and this is in contradistinction to years ago, if you are a white person convicted of first-degree murder in Illinois, you are 2.5 times more likely to be sentenced to death than an African American. Now, why? That doesn't sound like there's any bias at all. Why? Well, because we live in a segregated society. Chicago is certainly one of the most segregated cities in the United States. White people tend to associate with white people, thus they tend to murder white people. And it turns out that murdering a white person is punished with death 3.5 times more often than murdering a black person. And so there is a systemic bias. It's not a defendant bias, it's a victim bias. We systemically value white lives more highly than we value black lives. And when you ask law enforcement people about this, they'll point out that there are gangs, a lot of murders are gang related, and that's true, and certainly somebody who's joined a gang has sort of assumed the risk, and the murder doesn't necessarily rise to the same level of gravity. But I think the real reason for this differential is because power, privilege, status, wealth are still so unevenly distributed in our society. And you think of the victim as being worth more somehow. And we replicate through our criminal justice system and the death penalty some of the inherent inequities that exist in our society. And in this regard, the death penalty is obviously functioning in a deeply troubling way.
One of the big changes in criminal justice system over the past decade plus maybe is the increasing involvement of victims in the victim impact statements during sentencing of. What's your reaction to that? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What do you think victims' proper role is in, let's say, death penalty cases?
Well, first of all, one of the things that I knew not much about were the point of view of victims of violent crimes. Obviously, I defended Chris and Alex, and there were victim families in those cases, but they weren't confiding in me because I was on the other side. And I made it a point, along with many of my colleagues, to spend time with a lot of victim families, and there were a couple of things that I learned that I didn't recognize. Probably the most significant is that losing someone to a murder is unlike any other loss in life. And that is because it's not the result of something random like disease or accidental. It's because another human being made a conscious decision that this person who was essential to you would die. And it sort of stands the whole notion of civilization, of living in a society with other people, on its head. And, you know, the victims' families are deserving of enormous compassion. They feel, with some justification, that the law has failed them. And I'm not against their being informed or even sharing their grieving as part of the criminal process. But we have reached a pretty strange point. A case like Alex's, the Hernandez case, was driven by the victim family. They literally organized petition drives and chose who would prosecute the cases. And when victims take proprietorship of the system, it only increases the inequities. Because, for example, with Alex's case, the Nicarico family wanted death. The second little girl who was killed, Melissa Ackerman, her family wanted a quick end, and they were willing to accept life in prison without parole for Brian Dugan. And so you have identical crimes with two different results because of what the victims wanted. And the reality is that the notion that victims get closure out of the criminal justice system, which I'm willing to accept, still doesn't really justify doesn't justify the death penalty. Because the reality is that we say the victims deserve the death penalty, only when we want to do that as a society for our own reasons. 49 out of every 50 first-degree murders in this country do not result in a death sentence. And so we say 49 times out of 50 that the victims don't deserve it. And the fact of the matter is that we say the victims deserve it usually when prosecutors want a fig leaf of some kind, somebody to point the cameras to, someone who is weeping earnestly on our television screens. But the argument that the victims deserve it is, in the lawyer's terms, one that proves too much, because we don't give the victims that measure of justice in most first-degree murder cases.
And you're prepared to say to victims' families who say, you know, I want to go to court, I want to speak up, I want to participate. You are prepared to say, sorry, can't do it?
No, I'm happy to let them participate.
Well, but I thought you said they have too much influence.
Well, I think that's, I don't have a problem with victim impact testimony per se. What I have a problem with is saying that we're going to justify the death penalty for the sake of victims. That strikes me as going too far. It's fine to explain the magnitude of the crime, as far as I'm concerned, but that doesn't justify the death penalty.
Going back to the work of the commission, what were the most important recommendations that you came up with? What do you think were the best ideas that you had?
Well, I think the best idea we had is one that won't become law in Illinois, which is to create a review commission that looks at the decisions of each individual prosecutor. I mean, again, talking about arbitrariness, there are 102 different states' attorneys in Illinois, and God knows how many counties in California, where each individual prosecutor makes a decision about whether or not to seek the death penalty according to her or his own conscience. And it seemed to me, and seemed to the Commission, that these decisions should be more standardized, that there should be a statewide body made up principally of prosecutors that would oversee the death penalty election in every case.
The Justice Department does have something just like that.
They do.
No individual U.S. attorney can ask for the death penalty without going through this body that is meant to sort of make applications fairly uniform.
Right, although the current administration's answer has been basically, and I don't say this in a hostile way either, to try to avoid the differentials, they've been authorizing capital prosecutions more often.
And in times overruling
Right.
U.S. attorneys who don't want to ask for the death penalty.
Right, and ironically, American juries at the moment are very skittish about the death penalty, and in the 16 cases that had been tried as of about 3 months ago, juries had rejected the death penalty in 15 of them on the federal level. But we were talking about the Illinois Commission and our recommendations. That was one of them. One that I think is going to gain significant currency around the United States, I think it's actually practiced here in San Diego, is the videotaping of the interrogation of suspects in homicide cases.
Why is that so important?
Well, it'll do a tremendous amount to reduce the number of false confessions. False confessions arise for a number of different reasons. Overt coercion by the police, psychological or intellectual vulnerability on the part of certain defendants, and sometimes some embroidery by police officers about what was actually said. And obviously, if the videotape is running from the moment that the suspect comes into the police station, you're going to have a much clearer record. And by the way, one which, in the long run, will aid law enforcement much more than it will hurt it.
Why?
Because the evidence that the defendant actually confessed will be incontrovertible, and you're going to stop litigating motions to suppress, and you're going to stop having defendants who confessed saying that they didn't.
Did this legislature adopt some of your proposals?
That particular proposal has passed. There's a slight reduction in the felony murder exception in Illinois that's been passed. We have a new protocol for eyewitness testimony. Eyewitnesses, it turns out, are far more inaccurate than I was ever aware when I was a prosecutor. We have funding mandates that have been accepted by the state legislature, significant Capital Justice Act that provides 2 funded lawyers for all capital defenses, educational requirements to be a member of the capital defense bar, and a capital prosecution bar. So there's been substantial reform that's come as a result.
Finish the story of George Ryan, the end of his term.
Well, as Governor Ryan's term neared its end, our report had come in April of 2002. Because of this investigation, Ryan was wildly unpopular and couldn't run for re-election. Because of that, the state legislature basically held its nose and covered its eyes in terms of the report that we had made. And as George Ryan neared the end of his term, he had to confront the fact that there were 170 people on Illinois' death row. No reforms had been made to the system. And what was he going to do with the evidence that had been handed to him that there were substantial flaws in the system that had produced these 170 convictions and death sentences? And at the end of his term, George Ryan cleared Illinois' death row. He commuted the sentences, in 167 cases, he reduced the sentences from death to life in prison without parole. There were 4 people on Illinois' death row whom he was convinced, and I am convinced, were innocent, whose confessions had literally been tortured out of them in one of Chicago police station in the 1980s. They were, of course, released. 3 people's sentences were reduced to the level of their co-defendants. But he cleared Illinois' death row.
And what was the public reaction to that?
Well, this was extraordinary and showed me yet again that I really don't understand politics. Governor Ryan's argument that he had to do something because the legislature had done nothing rang true with a large number of Illinoisans. They were basically divided on the commutations, half and half. About half thought it was outrageous, or at least unwise, and half thought he had no choice. And because the commutations did not inspire the broad-scale outrage that somebody like me would have anticipated, the Illinois legislature was suddenly moved to action. They realized that half the electorate was sitting out there going, this is a mess and you guys have done nothing to clean it up. And so the commutations, on top of everything else, became the principal engine for reform of the Illinois capital system.
Before we take questions, which I hope we will, you've made somewhat of a reference to the fact that juries are more reluctant to impose the death penalty than they used to be. Talk about how the ebb and flow of public attitudes towards the death penalty has changed.
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to recite anything other than the public opinion data. It's clear, obviously, that there is a rising perception in the United States that the death penalty is applied unfairly. There is a when we say that there's a strong public majority in favor of the death penalty, that's true. The polling is between 60 and 70%. But when you say, should the maximum punishment for murder be the death penalty or life in prison without parole, the numbers change. There are 2 different polls last year, one 49-45 in favor of the death penalty, the other 53-45. So the gap is actually pretty small in American public opinion, and at the same time, we have over 40% of Americans who will say that the death penalty is applied unfairly.
And just to conclude, where did you wind up on the death penalty?
I ultimately said to myself that I had been asking the wrong question for years. I had been trying to figure out whether it was just to execute John Wayne Gacy. That was not the question that I should have been asking. The question that I should have been asking myself, I thought, was, can we construct a system of justice that reaches those right cases without also sweeping in the wrong cases, the cases of the occasional innocent or the more often undeserving of capital punishment, people like Chris. And I think, for reasons that we'll probably get to in the question and answer session, that we'll never construct such a system, that the death penalty will always remain flawed, and because it will always remain flawed, it will never serve the purpose of the kind of moral justice that most Americans want from it.
What percentage of civilized countries allow a death penalty? What are the international aspect of this?
Well, I think since Turkey, I believe, dropped it in order to get into the EU,
But isn't that's not a trivial fact?
It's not a trivial fact.
That the EU says you can't join if you have the death penalty.
It is not a trivial fact, and obviously if we're going to have to confront the fact that we stand alone in the community of nations. We're the only democracy that imposes the death penalty. It is imposed in Iran and China, but most South American countries do not impose the death penalty. We are unique in that regard, and while the contrast to Western Europe between our murder rates and their murder rates is quite noticeable, and does provide some justification for us having it, some of the South American countries do not have that differential.
And I've heard you say that you think it has to do with an attitude towards the state.
Well, I think that certainly in Western Europe, the experience of the Second World War and that epoch, which saw democracies repeatedly overtaken by the likes of Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, Salazar, left a lot of Europeans thinking that the state should never kill, because if the state does not have the power to kill, then you will know that when the state does kill, it is an outlaw regime. Because, you know, a lot of what went on in Germany went on under the name of the law. And so that many Europeans, having lived through that period, wanted to deprive the state of that power as a sort of fail-safe for when democracy stops working.
A couple questions here along the lines of what's the cost differential between death penalty, life in prison? Because I think on the surface a lot of people think, oh, why don't we execute someone or pay for their upkeep for 10, 20, 30 years.
Right. These are not the best people. Why should we be wasting money keeping them alive? And of course, it turns out that it's more expensive to execute them. And although some of this arises from conditions of confinement, because people on death row tend to be single cell, that is, they don't have other inmates living with them, because a guy who's sentenced to death doesn't make a particularly good roommate when you irritate him. But beyond those costs, there's a huge impact from people like me, from lawyers. In order to try a death penalty case, you have to basically try two cases, guilt and innocence, and then death. There's an enormous, and of course, since most people who end up being tried for capital murder are poor, their defense is maintained at the cost of the state. There are more lawyers, more shrinks, more experts, and then we get into the appeal process, where we have a whole separate jurisprudence created by the Supreme Court in the hopes of ending arbitrariness. And the appeals go on forever. The average in the United States in 2001 was 11 and a half years between conviction and execution. And the courts and the lawyers are working all that time. So at the end of the process, I think there's not a lot of controversy about this now. It was most recently studied by the state of Indiana. And they figured that execution's about 35% more expensive as an alternative.
Have you ever witnessed an execution? You have not.
No.
But do you think the method of execution has any bearing in this debate? Lethal injection, electrocution?
You know, having represented two men who were on death row, I think we're sort of fooling ourselves when we focus on the method of execution. There's no question that the cruelty of the death penalty inheres in two different aspects. One is for those people who have to live with that Damocletian sword over them for years at a time. And, you know, they're terrified. One may argue they should be terrified, and of course they've chosen to prolong this with their appeals, but it's very, very wearing. The other, of course, is the moment of execution, where you take somebody who is now 11 and a half years from the crime, very often not the same person, very often subdued because of their adjustment to confinement, and take that person and walk that person down that hall as they know every step of the way that this is their last walk, this is the last things they will ever see. The method by which you execute does not seem to me the point that we ought to be focusing on.
Several questions on the question of deterrence, whether the death penalty is a deterrence. One question, should you broadcast executions, perhaps a bigger deterrent? But just talk about the whole notion of deterrence.
Well, this was a particular interest of mine because it seemed to me a quick way out of my dilemma. If it turned out that killing killers kept other people from becoming murderers, then all of the problems with the death penalty arguably could be justified. And so I paid particular attention to the many studies of this subject that have been done. The overwhelming weight of research and opinion is that the death penalty is not a general deterrent. It does not keep other people from becoming murderers, especially when you realize that we're only talking about an incremental difference between life without parole and the death penalty. Just to do some comparison, you know, the death penalty states have higher murder rates than the states without the death penalties as a group. Texas, which has executed a third of the Americans who've been executed since 1977, still has a murder rate that's higher than the national average. When you compare states like Illinois and Michigan that are on almost all fours with one another in terms of income, racial makeup, population dispersion between rural and urban areas, Michigan, which hasn't executed anybody since 1848, and Illinois, which has the death penalty, the murder rate is lower in Michigan. Now, there are some free market economists who have attempted to prove that the death penalty is a deterrent. This is so much an effort to justify their own worldview, namely that, you know, we're all rational social actors who respond to incentives, that I find these enterprises suspicious to begin with, and their work has not been widely accepted by other professionals in this area. Certainly, though, if you're looking for a justification for the death penalty, you're not going to find clear evidence in the world of deterrence.
That's a good question. So last question, what are you working on now?
I am working on a novel about a court-martial during World War II. And this comes from my desire to write about some of the stories that my father told about his own wartime experience, but to put it in my own framework, you know, to make it my own, and that's my way of doing it.
Well, I'm sure we're all going to read it, and thank you very much for all your...